Hello everybody. Today I wanted to make a video about 5 things I wish I knew before I bought the Sony a6400. So first I want to talk about a couple of things real quick. The first is that one of my previous videos about the Leica Q2, that video has, as of now, almost 500 views. I can't believe it. I can't believe how many people saw that video. That's amazing. And I will make a follow-up to that video. Now, one of the commenters on that video said that I should hang something up on my walls, and several other people in my life have also told me that my background needs to be more interesting. So I've gone ahead and hung up these lights. Now I think it looks a little funny, but I don't know, we'll go with it for now. I'll leave it up and we'll see how this looks afterwards. Finally, the other quick thing I wanted to talk about was that my last video, the one about the autofocus on the Sony a6400, I shot that one in 4K. And I have to admit that the video quality was better. A part of me really wanted it to be no different than 1080p. But having seen the footage, I must admit the 4K video quality is better. Now, I can't really explain why. Okay, it's not just that it's more detailed, it is, but also things like highlight rendition and, highlight roll off. It looked better in 4K. I don't know why. It's like somehow the dynamic range is better in 4K than 1080p. Even though I didn't change any of the settings, it was still Cine 2 and Pro Color. The thing that really does boggle me though is why it looks more detailed, because I assume when you're shooting in 1080p and displaying in 1080p, you record 1 pixel for every 1 display pixel. And when you record 4K and display 1080p, you're recording 4 pixels for every 1 display pixel. And you'd have to average it to give you that 1 pixel. So why does it still look so much better? I don't know. Maybe it has something to do with the line skipping and pixel binning. I don't know. Anyway, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about 5 things that I wish I knew about the Sony a6400 before I bought it. So for this list, I'm not going to talk about things that most people know about, like the fact that it doesn't have in-body stabilization. Frankly, if you didn't know that before you bought the a6400, then you were living under a rock, because that's all anybody ever talked about. That and the flip-up screen being blocked by a shotgun mic. So I'm going to talk about things that are not so obvious, and I'm not saying that you couldn't find out about these things online, but you'd have to do some pretty deep Googling to figure this stuff out. So number 1 is proxy recording. I knew going in that the Sony a6400 allows you to record proxy videos. And I was really looking forward to that, because I thought that I could record in 4K, but record a proxy video in a lower resolution and edit using the lower resolution clips, but then render using 4K. And why this is helpful is because that's kind of what I already do with my video workflow. I use DaVinci Resolve for my video editing. Whenever I import video clips into DaVinci Resolve, I generate optimized media. And I do that because that makes the scrubbing and editing process go much smoother. If you don't generate optimized media and your computer is not very powerful, then it can stutter a lot when you're trying to scrub video. My computer kind of already struggles with 1080p, and so I've been routinely generating optimized media, but I was really looking forward to having the a6400 generate a proxy video file in camera. And that way, when I import it all into my computer, the optimized media would be ready to go. I hate generating optimized media because it takes time. It makes the editing process so much nicer, but it takes time, and it's almost a one-for-one time. If I record a 10-minute video file, it will take 10 minutes on my computer to generate optimized media. So for these types of videos, I routinely record somewhere on the order of about 20 to 30 minutes worth of video. And so once I import this to the computer, that's another 20 to 30 minutes of just sitting around waiting for the optimized media to generate. So having the a6400 generate those proxy clips in camera would be a big time saver. So having the a6400 generate these proxy clips in camera would also allow me to potentially record in 4K and bring it into Resolve and save a ton of time, because I assume that if it takes a one-to-one amount of time to generate media for 1080p, that it would take even longer to generate optimized media for 4K. However, what I didn't know and what I wish I knew before I got this camera was that the proxy clips, they're not really optimized media. They're just 720p versions of your video, and it's also recorded in H.264. Whereas Resolve, when it generates optimized media, uses DNxHR. So I don't think that you can use those proxy files as optimized media. And what's more, I can't find anything online about how I would do that anyway. I don't know how to tell DaVinci that this 4K file is linked to this other proxy file. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to tell DaVinci that, so that it will let me edit with the proxy file, but then render using the full resolution file. Maybe it works for other programs like Premiere Pro, I don't know, but I use Resolve and it doesn't work. So proxy files seem like it would speed up my workflow, but in actuality, it does not. So number 2 is the rolling shutter in 1080p. So I own the Sony Alpha 65, and the rolling shutter in 1080p at 24 frames a second is so bad that I refuse to record in 24 frames per second. That's the reason why I use a 30 frame per second timeline. Luckily, the Sony Alpha 65, when shooting 1080p at 60 frames a second, has much better rolling shutter. It gets imperceptible. And so I shoot in 60 frames per second and then just drop every other frame and work on a 30 frame per second timeline. So I was really worried about the a6400 also suffering from bad rolling shutter in 1080p 24. But I'm happy to say that that is not such a problem. Reviewers talked about the bad rolling shutter in 4K, and that is true. Rolling shutter in 4K on this camera is absolutely terrible. And it's terrible for the 24 frames a second and the 30 frame per second. It doesn't have 60 frames a second. So both frame rates for 4K on this camera are, to me, unusable because of rolling shutter. I mean, obviously, I gotta qualify that. It makes it useless handheld, because even if you're not doing whip pans, just the micro jitters renders the entire scene looking like jello. So to me, handheld 4K is no go on this camera. If you lock it off on a tripod, it's still usable. But I shoot 1080p most of the time, and so what I was interested in was rolling shutter in 1080p, and very few people talked about this. I even asked Gerald Undone on one of his live streams, and he answered that rolling shutter in 1080p was bad. That's not true. I suspect he didn't test it, because I will show you some examples of this camera doing 1080p in 24 frames per second, and you'll see that the rolling shutter is very well controlled. So if you're a 1080p shooter and you're worried about the rolling shutter and that's putting you off from buying this camera, let me reassure you, you're okay. 1080p does not suffer from very bad rolling shutter. All right, number 3 is something that I actually kind of knew before I got the camera, but I'm going to throw it in anyway just because it's I think it's very crucially important, and very few people are talking about this. So what I'm talking about is the fact that the built-in pop-up flash for this camera cannot be used to optically trigger off-camera Sony flashes. So I have a Sony HVL f43M flash that I used to use with my Sony a65. And like any other competent photographer, I very frequently would take the flash off camera and trigger it using the pop-up flash on the Alpha 65. I was really hoping that I could do that also with the a6400, but unfortunately you can't. So there's no way to trigger that flash wirelessly unless you buy some kind of radio frequency transmitter and attach it to this camera, and if you attach the receiver on the off-camera flash. So anyway, that's a total bummer for me, because I was really hoping to use my existing flash, but just know that you cannot use this camera to optically trigger an off-camera flash. Now that said, I think the newer Sony flashes do have radio receivers built in. You would still need to buy a radio transmitter for the camera though to trigger those newer flashes. Though Gerald Undone published a video a little while ago talking about the Godox flash system. That's a pretty affordable radio wireless flash system that you can get for Sony cameras and Canon cameras, and you can mix them all together. It's really good. It's like the perfect flash. So if I were to buy more flashes for this camera, I would probably go with the Godox system. Okay, moving on to number 4. There is no eye autofocus in video mode. Now that might sound like a big deal, but it actually isn't. The face autofocus for video is very, very good, and because video, unlike photos, your subject's constantly moving, it's pretty hard to tell if the camera is not perfectly focused on the eyes. So yes, there's no eye autofocus in video for this camera, but the face tracking autofocus is pretty good, and I have no complaints there. All right, and finally, for the last one, it's a bit of a weird one. You can't use plug-in power for the camera and charge the battery at the same time. So when I first got this camera, I installed the battery in there and I plugged the camera in to external power, and I could see the charging light go on. And I was like, okay, that's good. And then of course, I was eager to play around with the camera, so I turned it on, and I noticed that the charging light went off. So I thought maybe like the cable was bad, or the USB receptacle on the camera was bad, like it's loose or something. So I had like this almost sense of panic, like I received a defective unit. I even tried different USB cables because I was thinking that was the problem. It was only a few minutes later that I realized that if you look at the top right corner, you'll see that the battery, beside the battery icon, you have the plug icon indicating that it's plugged in, even though it's not charging. So at least that confirmed that the cable and the USB receptacle on the camera are working because power is being delivered to the camera. It's just not able to power the camera and charge the battery at the same time. It's a minor point, I admit it, but it did give me a little bit of a scare when I first got this camera, so I figured that I would share this with you. So that's it. That's it for this video. 5 things I wish I knew about the a6400 before I got it. I'll see you in the next one. And finally, for those who care, I am again shooting on Cine 2. I love the look of it, and it is still pro color. What I have changed though is the exposure compensation. I bumped it up to positive 0.3 just because it was looking a little bit dark. So that's about the only change. It's still 1080p at 30 frames a second. No 4K this time. The other major change is that I moved the microphone around a little bit. So instead of having the Blue Yeti stand straight up, I have it kind of pointing to the side, and I'm going to show it to you now. So hopefully the audio is still good. I figured that with it pointed horizontally, I can get it closer to my mouth without it covering my mouth. So we'll see how this goes. Hopefully the audio is still okay, and we'll see if I keep using it this way.